When you look at all the other commandments in the Decalogue, they all deal with particular actions that we are to avoid, and that would be considered sinful in the eyes of God. But when we talk about the commandment against coveting, here God is speaking to an interior disposition that we are all called to have as His holy people, without which we couldn't hope to fulfill the other commandments in the Decalogue. However, coveting is not simply wanting something. Because, we could go to a friend's house and admire their house, and perhaps even ourselves wish you had a house as nice as that, or wish you had a car as nice as your friend's. But when we're talking about coveting, we're talking about a disposition of desiring something so much that someone else has that it causes alienation and has the potential for harm in our relationship with one another, and in many ways distracts us away from recognizing the call and the generosity that God has for each one of us. And so as we look at the commandments, you shall not covet your neighbor's spouse, you shall not covet your neighbor's goods, we see it as God calling us to that interior attitude, that interior disposition that we are all called to have as His holy people. The 9th commandment states very plainly, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. In our modern disposition, we could say, you shall not covet your neighbor's spouse. And in this commandment, God calls on us to have a purity of heart, and a disposition in which we are not pining for someone else's spouse, but we recognize the call we have to our own. If we don't have one, we are not pining to steal someone else's spouse to fulfill our own needs for love and companionship, but rather search for that person God has called us to love for our lives till death do us part. And in that we find a purity of heart that leads us away from the disposition in which we would violate the commandment, you shall not commit adultery. And so it's important in this separation of the two commandments, of coveting one's spouse as opposed to coveting one's goods, that we are called to that purity of heart, which preserves the integrity and the dignity of marriage, the relationship of a husband to his wife and a wife to her husband, and how we bear forth children, create the institution of the family, pass on that faith from one generation to the other, and recognize the vocation of love, especially married love, that God has called some of us to in this life. The 10th and final commandment states, you shall not covet your neighbor's goods. And this commandment calls us to a poverty of heart. It calls us to appreciate God's gifts in our lives, whether it's what comes from our own talents, which is a gift from God, or the possessions that we are glad to have as gifts from God. And when we can recognize God's generosity to us, then we can exercise appropriate generosity to those in need, which is, of course, a calling that God has always had for His people, both in the Old and New Testaments, whether the tradition is of Judaism or Christianity. But when we find ourselves coveting the goods of our neighbor, the extreme disposition of coveting leads to that alienation that we risk between one another, but also we are distracted away from recognizing God's generosity to us because we are so fixated on what someone else has that we do not appreciate the things that we do have. And so the last commandment calls on us to a poverty of heart, in which we recognize that everything we have is ultimately a gift from God. When we can recognize that, then we can have that true interior disposition of gratitude for what we have. And with that sense of gratitude, we can exercise true Christian generosity to those in need.